Hey everyone, Mr. Evans here with your pre-recorded live lesson for Unit 6, Lesson 4 on gene expression. You may notice a couple of things in this recording that are not in Connexus, so listen up and pay attention. We're going to talk about Punnett squares and sex-linked traits, and it's not really covered in the lesson, so it's important you watch this video. So this should only take about 15 minutes to go over these things, and then we'll go over the quick check, and there's a little video for you to watch, an animation at the end. So heredity and genetics, this is why you look like your parents. There was a monk named Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk, who was the first person to really investigate this phenomenon. People knew, just for obvious reasons, that children looked like their parents, and offspring from any animal or plant looked like its parents. But he's the first person to really investigate the how and the why. This was back before the modern day, so his methods were limited, but he did get some good results, and he's considered the father of modern genetics. So genetics come in two types, dominant or recessive. And you may have heard these words before. Genes all come in pairs, and a type of gene is called an allele. So for example, the gene would be for, say, hair color, and an allele would be for blonde hair or brown hair. And you get one allele from each one of your parents. Maybe your dad has blonde hair and your mom has brown hair. So you might get the blonde allele from dad and the brown allele from mom. Now, of these pairs, one is dominant and one is recessive. That's a simplified explanation, but that's where we're going to start. There are other things that come into play, like codominance and shared dominance and incomplete dominance, that we're going to get to in a later lesson. But for this one, we're going to learn about dominant and recessive. Sometimes one gene will completely mask another one. So you could have both of them, but only one is expressed in the organism. So for example, let's just say that brown hair was dominant over blonde hair, and blonde hair was recessive. So if dad has blonde hair and mom has brown hair, you're going to have both genes, but only the brown hair will be expressed, and you'd have brown hair. That's just an example of dominant and recessive, and I'm not even sure if that's accurate, but it's a simplified example in terms of how dominant and recessive worked. Hair color actually has a lot of different factors that come into play, but that's how dominant and recessive work. So therefore, you can have the following combinations of alleles. If both your parents have brown hair, then you're going to have two genes for brown hair. If both your parents have blonde hair, then you might have two genes for blonde hair. Now, you could have one of each. One blonde, one brown, one dominant, one recessive. So if you have two dominant genes, that is called homozygous dominant. Homo means same, you've got the same, they're both dominant, homozygous dominant. For example, in this example, if you had two genes for blonde hair, you'd be homozygous recessive. Or you could have one of each, one for brown hair, one for blonde hair. That is called heterozygous. A dominant gene will, quote, cover up a recessive one, but you would still be a carrier, and you could conceivably pass that gene on to your offspring. So in this example here, we would say, like this is an example with rabbits instead of human hair color. We would, and again, I don't know if this is accurate, but this is the example I'm using. White coat would be dominant in this rabbit. Dark coat would be dominant, would be recessive here. That's just the example we're going to use for our Punnett square. And a Punnett square is a graphical representation of crossing two animals and two different traits. So our next slide is going to talk about phenotype. Phenotype is the word you use for what an organism looks like. It's what is actually expressed by the organism. And the genotype are the genes that the organism is carrying. So even in this rabbit example, if white coat is dominant over dark coat, this rabbit could still be carrying the gene for dark fur, even though it's not expressed. Dominant and recessive genes are described using capital and lowercase letters. That's how we're going to set it up in our Punnett square. And we'll get to that on the next slide. But for our example, in pea plants, which is what Gregor Mendel used, yellow is dominant, so that's going to get an uppercase Y for yellow, and green is recessive, so it's going to get a lowercase y, not a G, because the gene we're talking about is color in the pea plant. The alleles are yellow or green, so the types of gene for the color is called the allele. So yellow and green are alleles of pod color in the pea plants, and we're going to use uppercase Y for yellow and a lowercase y for green. So you're going to use the lowercase letter for the recessive version of the gene. So let's go ahead and cross a couple of rabbits here. In this example, we're going to have the white coat be dominant. We're going to have the black coat be recessive. Keeping in mind that the terms dominant or recessive, they don't mean one is better than the other. There is no like straight up better in these kinds of things. I mean, it depends on where the rabbit lives. If the rabbit lives in northern Canada, then for obvious reasons, having a white coat is better. But if the rabbit lives in the forest, then having a dark coat is better. Dominant doesn't mean better. It just means that it will show up if you have one of each of the genes. So what's better or worse or whatever is dependent upon the environment and the organism's habitat and situation. But in this example, we're going to call white coat dominant and dark coat recessive. And we're going to cross this rabbit with this rabbit. And this rabbit is homozygous dominant. This rabbit has two dominant white coat genes, and this rabbit is homozygous recessive, has two recessive dark coat genes. So we're going to make ourselves a little square here, and we're going to put this rabbit on the top. We're going to split up the genes, and we'll call this mom. We'll call this rabbit mom. So we're going to put her two alleles right here. She's got two big W's. We're going to put that up there. And we'll call this rabbit dad. We're going to put his recessive genes down here. And then all we're going to do is we're going to bring them down into the box and cross them. And this is representative of their offspring. So we got big W, little w, big W, little w, big W, little w, big W, little w. Now, remember we said that in this example, the white coat is the dominant trait. So all of these offspring will have one dominant white coat and one recessive dark coat. These are all heterozygous. They have one of each. So what is expressed on all of these offspring? All of these offspring are going to have the white coat color. Now, that's what's going to be expressed. That is the phenotype. But, going back, if one of these rabbits have offspring, they are still carrying the gene for the dark coat color. So conceivably, their offspring could have the dark coat color. That is a single cross Punnett square. And you're going to learn about a double cross Punnett square in the next lesson. But for now, we're just going to start with a single cross. So make some stuff up. Make up some traits. Assign one to be dominant. Assign one to be recessive. It doesn't matter really what it is. Just pick a trait. Eye color, hair color, toe length, earlobes, whatever. And assign one for dominant, one recessive, and make yourself up a couple of Punnett squares and try a bunch of different combinations and see what happens. So sex-linked traits. As we mentioned in a previous lesson, humans have 22 pairs of autosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes for a total of 23 pairs, a total of 46 chromosomes altogether. For the sex chromosomes, if you have XX as your pair, you're female. If you have XY as your pair, you're male. There are some exceptions to this. Some individuals have double X, like their XXX or their XYY. That does happen occasionally. Some people have shortened X or Y chromosomes, but there's a whole lot of variations on that. But we're just speaking generally here, because because there's too much to get into for all those other things. But generally speaking, XX is female, XY is male. Now, here's the key thing. Mom always gives you an X. Mom is female. She only has X's to give. She's always going to give an X to her offspring because that's all she has. Dad can give you an X or a Y. It's random. Does the sperm have an X chromosome in it or a Y chromosome in it? It's random. So the father is the one who determines the gender by random happenstance. So XX is female, XY is male. Dad determines the gender randomly. It's random, 50-50 chance. So here's where sex-linked traits come in. There are other genes on the X and the Y chromosomes that have nothing to do with the gender appearance or whatever of the offspring. There's other stuff on there. And some of them are duplicated, some of them are not. Some of them are exclusively for males, which makes males develop into males, but there's stuff that is shared by both males and females on there too. But if those genes exist only on the X or Y chromosome, they're limited to some of these traits are limited to one biological sex. So for example, there's stuff on the Y chromosome that only males have because females don't have a Y chromosome. So that can have some consequences for certain conditions and certain traits. So it's affected by what's on those X or Y chromosomes. Now, some genes, you have to have two functioning pairs for the proper trait to be expressed, for the proper thing to happen, to develop properly. Some genes, you have to have two functional alleles. Some, you only need one. So as long as you get one from mom or from dad, you're good. Now, but if you don't, you could run into problems. Parents can carry a gene for a trait but not express it. For example, mom could have a functional gene for a trait on one of her X chromosomes and a defective one on the other. But since she has one that works fine, that's all she needs. But she's still carrying the defective one. And she could pass that on to her offspring just through random happenstance. Now, if that offspring is male, and she donates that defective X chromosome to him, he's male, that means dad donated a Y. So the only X chromosome he's getting came from mom. If that's the defective one, that's a problem because he then does not have that functional gene on his X chromosome. So that trait would then be expressed in the male, and if the offspring is male in this particular instance. If the offspring is female, then that means dad donated a functional X chromosome, assuming he has one. Let's assume that dad has functioning X chromosomes. So if the offspring's female, that means dad donated a functional X chromosome, and it doesn't matter that mom donated the defective one. She has one that works. She's still carrying that defective chromosome, could pass it on to her offspring again, but for her, she's got the one functional X chromosome from dad, so she's good. But she's still a carrier. Now, the reverse also holds true. There are some conditions that are that affect female because if you have think of the reverse. You could get, let's say both parents have some defective gene on their X chromosomes. Then she would be getting a double dose of a bad gene, whereas if it was just one, could probably get along just fine. It's kind of the reverse situation. But just understand that some of these genes depend on having one functional chromosome. Now, males are more often affected by sex-linked conditions because they only have one X chromosome, and the X chromosome is much bigger. There is more stuff on the X chromosome. The Y chromosome is actually pretty small. There's not a lot of stuff on there. Just mostly traits for male physiology and a couple of other things are on there. So it's smaller. So that's why males are more likely to be affected by sex-linked disorders, because if they get the bad chromosome from mom and dad doesn't give them an X because they got a Y because they're male, That's all they got. So for certain things like color blindness and baldness, for example, those are things that affect males um, more often than females. So that's the sex-linked chromosome, and now I'm going to play you a little animation that puts together Punnett squares with sex-linked chromosomes. So have a watch. After it's over, that is the end of the lesson. The multiple choice question will be after the Amoeba Sisters animation, so you can watch that animation. It's pretty cool. Or you can just kind of skip over it to get directly to the multiple choice question. Okay, thanks very much. Have a good day.
Would you like to know one of the most underappreciated pieces of cytoplasm out there? Platelets. We take for granted the function of our platelets, which are fragments of cytoplasm that help stop us from bleeding. They help our blood clot when we get hurt. But there is a disorder called hemophilia that can affect those platelets because special clotting factor proteins that are needed to work with the platelets may not work correctly. So even a basic cut could be dangerous for people with hemophilia because they could bleed continuously. We have many treatments for the symptoms of hemophilia, and this has greatly improved outcomes with this disorder, although it wasn't always that way. Hemophilia is a sex-linked recessive trait, which means it's different from the basic Mendelian genetic problems. What do I mean by that? Well, we still use the terms dominant and recessive for alleles, but this time, because it's sex-linked, the alleles are on sex chromosomes. This is the case with sex-linked traits. So what is a sex chromosome? Well, recall that humans have 46 chromosomes. Chromosomes are made up of DNA and protein, and they contain your genes. Well, 2 of your 46 chromosomes, they are called the sex chromosomes. In a karyotype, it is usually the last 2 chromosomes that are the sex chromosomes. The sex chromosomes are called X and Y chromosomes, but it has nothing to do with the shape of the chromosome. That's always kind of confusing, but please don't think that Y chromosomes are shaped like a Y and X chromosomes are shaped like an X. This used to always confuse me. It has nothing to do with their name. The reason they got their name is actually kind of interesting, so to the Google for that. Everyone has an X chromosome, but if you have another X chromosome, meaning you have 2 X chromosomes, you are female. And if you have a Y chromosome, meaning you have an X and a Y chromosome, you are male. There are also genetic disorders where you can have extra copies of sex chromosomes, but we will not go into that in this clip. Sex-linked traits are traits that are specifically on the sex chromosomes. Most sex-linked traits tend to be on the X chromosome because it is larger than the Y chromosome and it contains more genes than the Y chromosome. The disorder hemophilia is like this. Now we will use the letter capital H to represent an allele for having normal blood clotting function, and a letter lowercase h to represent an allele for having hemophilia. Hemophilia is a sex-linked recessive disorder, which is why it's being represented by a lowercase letter h. Only it must be placed on the sex chromosome as a superscript, like an exponent. A woman that does not have hemophilia could have the genotype X big H, X big H, or X big H, X little h. Because as long as she's got at least one dominant allele, that dominating allele will be what shows. So no hemophilia, since again, hemophilia is a recessive sex-linked disorder. The only way for her to have hemophilia would be the genotype X little h, because only when there is no dominant present will that recessive show up, at least in this type of trait. Now for a male to not have hemophilia, his genotype would have to be X big H, Y. Notice how I did not put anything on the Y chromosome. Again, most sex-linked traits are on the X chromosome. If he has the genotype X little h, Y, then he has hemophilia. He doesn't have 2 X chromosomes, so he cannot be a carrier. So let's say that 2 people that do not have hemophilia have children. However, let's say that the woman is a carrier. That means she is heterozygous. How do you do a sex-linked Punnett square cross for this kind of trait? Step 1. Identify the genotypes of the parents. So the mother was a carrier. She is X big H, X little h. She does not have hemophilia because of that dominant allele present, but she is a carrier. The male, if he does not have hemophilia, well, he must be X big H, Y. There's no other option for him. Step 2. Place one parent on the top, outside of the square like this, and place the other parent on the left, outside of the square like this. Step 3. Cross them. For formatting purposes, place X chromosomes before Y, and you also write any sex chromosomes with dominant letters first. The results you get in the squares would be the offspring, the babies. The genotype ratio could be written out like this. The phenotype ratio, remember that these are the observable traits, can be written out that there is a 75% chance that the child will be born without hemophilia and a 25% chance that a child would have hemophilia for this boy here. You could also make this a ratio, so 3-to-1. Notice that in this type of example of a sex-linked recessive disorder, males are more likely to inherit this disorder because there is only one X chromosome present. This is true for many other sex-linked recessive disorders, such as colorblindness. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.